It was a quiet suburban night in Springfield, Ohio. The kind of night where nothing unusual ever seemed to happen. The streets were empty, the houses stood still under the faint glow of the streetlights, and most families were sound asleep. But inside one modest two-story home, something was very wrong. At exactly 11:47 p.m., a trembling little hand picked up the phone and dialed 911. On the other end of the line, the dispatcher, Officer Sarah Mitchell, heard the panicked, tear-soaked voice of a child. "Please help me," the young girl sobbed, her words breaking apart with fear. "Something's moving in my stomach." Sarah froze for a second, unsure if she had heard correctly. She softened her tone, asking, "Sweetheart, what's your name?" The child whispered, Emily Parker. I'm 9 years old." Sarah pressed further, trying to steady her voice. "Emily, can you tell me what's happening? Is it pain? Did you eat something?" But the answer Sarah received was nothing like what she expected. Through sharp breaths and muffled cries, Emily whispered, "It feels like something is scratching me from the inside." For the first time in her years as a dispatcher, Sarah felt her pulse quicken. She assumed it must be a severe medical emergency, perhaps appendicitis or some rare infection, but the way Emily described it was unlike anything she had ever heard before. Wasting no time, Sarah dispatched paramedics to the Parker residence, instructing them to hurry. Within minutes, flashing red and blue lights washed across the quiet neighborhood as an ambulance pulled into the driveway. Emily's mother, Laura Parker, rushed to open the door, her face pale with confusion. She had put Emily to bed just 2 hours earlier, perfectly healthy, and now her little girl was doubled over on the living room couch, clutching her stomach, her tiny frame shaking with sobs. "She was fine," Laura cried to the medics. "She was absolutely fine before bed. What's happening to her?" The paramedics carefully lifted Emily onto the stretcher, doing their best to calm her down as she whimpered about the strange movement inside her belly. They rushed her to Springfield General Hospital, Laura following close behind. At the emergency room, doctors quickly ran tests. They checked her vitals, drew blood, and ordered an ultrasound to look for internal issues. The initial scans came back clean. No sign of obstruction, no evidence of parasites, no internal bleeding. Emily's stomach looked perfectly normal, and yet her cries told a different story. She kept insisting that she could feel something crawling inside her, scratching against her from the inside out. Doctors exchanged skeptical glances, trying not to alarm the mother who stood by Emily's bedside, wringing her hands in despair. "Maybe it's anxiety," one nurse whispered. "Maybe it's a stress response." But before anyone could suggest further tests, something caught their eyes. Something none of them were prepared for. As Emily lay back on the hospital bed, tiny red lines began to form across her abdomen, as if scratches were appearing beneath her skin. The marks grew darker, more defined, pressing outward as though something was clawing from within her stomach, trying to escape. The room fell silent. Laura gasped in horror, covering her mouth with trembling hands. One of the doctors instinctively stepped back, his face pale as he stammered, That's impossible." The scratches moved slowly, traveling across her belly like the trails of some unseen creature. Emily's cries grew louder, more desperate, her small hands gripping the hospital sheets as tears streamed down her face. "Please make it stop," she begged, her voice breaking. "It's hurting me." The doctors, who moments earlier believed this was nothing more than a gastrointestinal issue, now stood frozen, unable to explain what they were seeing. For Officer Sarah Mitchell, who had arrived at the hospital after finishing her dispatch shift, the sight was almost too much to process. She had heard countless calls in her career, domestic disputes, accidents, even overdoses, but nothing had prepared her for this. This was not a simple medical case, nor was it the rambling imagination of a frightened child. Something was happening to Emily Parker, something unexplainable, something that defied every logical answer. Sarah's mind raced with questions, her heart pounding in her chest as she tried to steady herself. Could something alive really be inside this 9-year-old girl? Emily was admitted to the hospital under close observation, her fragile body trembling as though something inside her was fighting to break free. The doctors moved quickly, but no one seemed more concerned than Dr. James Rowland, a seasoned pediatric specialist with nearly 20 years of experience. He had treated countless strange cases, rare infections, genetic conditions, even parasites that shocked medical journals. But as he reviewed Emily's file, he felt a creeping unease. The symptoms didn't match anything he had seen before. He thought back to medical reports of rare parasitic infestations that had baffled science, but never once had there been mention of visible claw-like scratches appearing beneath the skin. Something about this case felt different. Something about it felt unnatural. Emily whimpered in her hospital bed, gripping her mother's hand tightly. Her eyes were wide and red from crying, and she looked at Dr. Rowland with a mixture of terror and pleading. "It's whispering," she said in a weak voice. At first he thought she meant the nurses speaking in hushed tones around her, but Emily shook her head slowly, pointing to her stomach. "Inside me," she whispered. "I can hear it. It talks sometimes." The room went cold. Laura, her mother, froze in disbelief, staring at her daughter in horror. Dr. Rowland tried to remain calm, but his chest tightened. Children had active imaginations, yes, but Emily's words carried a sincerity that could not be dismissed. Then, without warning, the steady beeping of Emily's heart monitor spiked violently. Her small body arced upward as if something inside her was clawing and thrashing to escape. Doctors rushed to her side, pressing buttons, checking vitals, barking orders. The monitor continued to scream, her pulse racing at an inhuman speed. Laura sobbed, begging someone to help her daughter. Dr. Rowland grabbed the ultrasound machine, moving swiftly to capture whatever was happening inside Emily's stomach. He pressed the probe against her abdomen, the black and white image flickering on the screen. At first, it showed nothing but static shapes, until suddenly a faint outline appeared. Everyone in the room gasped. On the monitor, in the shadows of Emily's belly, there was something that did not belong to a human body. Its shape was distorted, but clear enough to make out. The faint silhouette of a hand, small but sharp, ended in something resembling claws. It shifted, then curled, as though responding to the probe itself. A nurse dropped her clipboard, the sound echoing through the silent room. Laura clutched her chest in terror, shaking her head as tears streamed down her face. Dr. Rowland froze, his breath caught in his throat. The sight was impossible, and yet it was there before his eyes. Something living, something alien to science, moving inside a 9-year-old child. By morning, the hospital was no longer quiet. Word of Emily's case had slipped beyond the sterile walls. A nurse who had seen the ultrasound whispered about it to her husband, and within hours the story had spread like wildfire through the town. Reporters gathered outside the hospital, cameras flashing, desperate for a glimpse of the little girl at the center of the mystery. Neighbors whispered theories over fences, while strangers speculated online. Some claimed it was a new kind of parasite never seen before. Others insisted it was demonic possession, while conspiracy theorists argued that Emily might be the victim of a government experiment gone wrong. Springfield, usually a sleepy, uneventful town, was suddenly consumed by fear and curiosity. Inside the hospital room, however, the mood was far from sensational. Laura stayed by her daughter's side, exhausted, her hands trembling as she stroked Emily's hair. The child slept restlessly, twitching at times, as though still battling something unseen. Laura's phone buzzed on the nightstand. She picked it up, expecting another message from worried relatives. But what she heard chilled her to the bone. A distorted voice on the other end whispered, "This is not medical. It's something your family buried long ago." Laura's grip on the phone tightened, her heart slamming against her ribs. She opened her mouth to speak, but the call cut off before she could ask anything. She sat frozen in the dim glow of the hospital room, her blood running cold. Those words echoed in her mind like a curse, something her family buried long ago. What could it mean? She looked at Emily, her frail little girl, and then back at the phone in her hand, realizing this nightmare was only beginning. Could it be true? Could Emily's suffering be tied not to a disease, but to a dark secret buried in their past? Laura sat in the hospital waiting room long after midnight, her nerves frayed and her body trembling with exhaustion. When Officer Sarah Mitchell arrived to check on Emily's condition, Laura finally broke her silence. Her eyes were red, her voice weak, but her words carried a weight that Sarah could not ignore. She admitted that years ago, when she and her husband bought their home, they were told that the property was built over the remains of an abandoned church basement. Local gossip had always claimed the place was cursed. At the time, Laura brushed off the rumors as nothing more than old superstitions. But now, with her daughter lying in a hospital bed suffering from something no doctor could explain, the stories came rushing back like a tidal wave of dread. Laura described the strange occurrences that had been happening in the house over the years. Whispers that seemed to come from inside the walls, objects moving on their own in the dead of night, lights flickering when no one touched the switch. Emily herself had long been plagued by nightmares, waking up screaming about a shadow child that stood at the foot of her bed. Laura confessed she had ignored these warnings, convincing herself it was only stress, imagination, or childish fears. But now she wondered if she had been wrong all along.
Dr. James Rowland, overwhelmed by the bizarre symptoms, reached out to a colleague, Dr. Helen Carter, a respected child psychologist. If this was some form of trauma, he hoped she could help unravel it. Dr. Carter arrived the next morning and spent time observing Emily. She listened carefully to Laura's stories, but remained skeptical. Children often manifest fear through physical symptoms, she explained calmly. Nightmares, stomach pains, even hallucinations can all be signs of deep psychological trauma. She suggested that perhaps Emily was carrying subconscious stress, maybe connected to something in the family's past, and her body was manifesting it in disturbing ways. Dr. Rowland wanted to believe her, but the evidence he had seen on the ultrasound, the claw-like outline, the scratches forming on Emily's skin, was impossible to explain through psychology alone. Still, he kept his doubts quiet, trying to avoid panic. But that night, all illusions of a medical or psychological cause were shattered. In the early hours of the morning, Laura jolted awake to the sound of her daughter gagging. She rushed to Emily's side, just in time to see the child retch violently. The nurses scrambled, holding her upright, trying to soothe her, but what came out of Emily's mouth was not bile, not food, not anything remotely normal. On the floor lay a small, jagged object, wet and stained. Laura's eyes widened in horror as the nurses gasped and stepped back. Under the harsh hospital lights, the object was unmistakable. It was a fragment of bone. Human bone.
The room fell into stunned silence. One nurse muttered in disbelief. Another dropped her gloves and backed toward the door. Dr. Rowland was called immediately, and when he examined the piece, his face went pale. This was no delusion. This was no child's imagination. Something truly horrifying was happening inside Emily. They rushed her for an X-ray, desperate for answers. The image that appeared on the monitor nearly drove the room to chaos. Inside Emily's abdomen, faint but undeniable, were tiny skeletal fragments. Not random shapes, not calcified deposits, but bones, small and jagged, shifting ever so slightly as if alive. The staff stared in disbelief. The outline looked like pieces of more than one skeleton, fragments too small to belong to an adult, yet disturbingly human in form. Laura collapsed into a chair, shaking uncontrollably, whispering prayers under her breath. Dr. Rowland pressed a trembling hand to his forehead, unable to reconcile what he was seeing. The medical staff argued quietly among themselves, trying to come up with rational explanations. Was it something swallowed? A genetic deformity? A hallucination on the scan? But none of it made sense, and deep down they all knew it. Something unnatural was happening here. Meanwhile, Emily lay still on the hospital bed, her breathing shallow, her small body fragile and weak. In her sleep, her lips moved, as if murmuring words no one else could hear. The nurses leaned in closer, and for a moment, everyone in the room froze. Emily was whispering in a voice not her own, speaking words that were faint but chilling, words that made the air grow heavier. No one could understand the language, but its tone was haunting, almost like a chant from long ago. The terror in the room was undeniable. Was Emily being consumed from the inside by something alive? Or was she being possessed by something far darker, something buried beneath the cursed home her family had lived in? Officer Sarah Mitchell could not let the mystery rest. After hearing Laura's confession about the cursed property and witnessing Emily's impossible symptoms, she decided to dig deeper. Together with Dr. James Rowland, she spent hours combing through old archives and dusty property records at the county courthouse. At first, the documents seemed ordinary: blueprints, land transfers, renovation notes. But then Sarah stumbled upon a faded, water-stained folder from nearly a century ago. Inside were brittle newspaper clippings, yellowed with age, describing a fire in 1923 that had destroyed a small orphanage connected to a church on the very land where the Parker home now stood. According to the reports, dozens of children had been trapped in the basement when the fire consumed the building. Their bodies were never properly recovered, their remains buried hastily in the ruins as the church was abandoned and eventually built over. Dr. Rowland's face turned pale as he read the headlines. Tragedy strikes local orphanage, no survivors. The words were chilling, but what struck him even more was the location. It was the exact site where the Parker home had been built decades later. Sarah exchanged a grim look with him. Could it be that the whispers Emily described, the nightmares of the shadow child, and even the bone fragments inside her were all tied to those forgotten souls? The thought was unthinkable, yet it was the only explanation that fit. Their findings to Laura, a frantic call came from the hospital. Emily's condition had worsened. She was bleeding internally, her stomach swelling as though something inside her was tearing her apart. Dr. Rowland rushed back, his heart racing, knowing that surgery was now the only option to save her. The operating room was prepared quickly. Nurses moved with urgency, wheeling Emily in, attaching IVs and setting up monitors. Laura stood outside the door, sobbing, her hands pressed together in prayer, while Officer Sarah tried to steady her own breathing, bracing herself for whatever horror might unfold next. Inside the operating room, the atmosphere was tense. The surgical team gathered, masks on, tools ready, their faces betraying unease. Emily lay still on the table, pale and fragile, her small chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. As the anesthesiologist prepared her, the lights above flickered once, then twice. A low hum seemed to echo through the room. Suddenly, without warning, the lights went out completely, plunging the operating room into darkness. Gasps filled the room. A nurse fumbled for a flashlight, another for the emergency power switch. But in the silence, a sound broke through. Emily's voice. Only it was not her voice. It was deeper, layered, filled with sorrow and anger. From her lips came a chilling whisper. "We never left. We were forgotten." The words rippled through the room, making every hair stand on end. Nurses froze in place, their eyes wide. One of them dropped a tray of instruments, the clatter echoing like thunder in the dark.
Then, shadows began to crawl across the walls, moving independently of the people in the room. They stretched and twisted, growing longer, darker, as if the very spirits of the lost children had awakened. Panic spread among the staff, their fear mounting as the air grew thick and cold. Dr. Rowland, his voice shaking, urged everyone to stay calm, but his own hands trembled as he clutched the edge of the surgical table. Emily's body arched upward, her mouth opening in a silent scream, until suddenly she let out a piercing cry that seemed to split the silence. From her small frame erupted a dark mist, thick and swirling, rising into the air like smoke from an unseen fire. The shadows quivered, the room filling with a suffocating energy. The mist twisted violently, circling overhead, and then as quickly as it had appeared, it dissipated into nothingness, leaving behind only silence. At that very moment, the emergency power kicked in, flooding the room with harsh, sterile light. Everyone turned their eyes back to the monitors. The frantic beeping that had filled the room moments before now slowed to a steady rhythm. Emily's vital signs stabilized.
Her breathing returned to normal, her body relaxing against the table as though the weight that had been crushing her had finally lifted. She was alive. She had survived. But the room was far from calm. The nurses stood frozen, pale and shaken. Some whispered prayers under their breath. Others simply stared at Emily in stunned disbelief. No one spoke of what they had just witnessed, because no explanation existed. What had left Emily's body was not something science could explain. It was something older, something forgotten, something that had lingered for nearly a century beneath the ground her family called home. Officer Sarah and Dr. Rowland arrived just as the team wheeled Emily out of surgery. And when they looked into the doctor's eyes, they knew the truth. Something had been expelled from that child, something that did not belong in the world of the living. But one question remained, hanging heavily over them all like a shadow they could not shake. Were these children's souls truly trapped inside Emily all along? And if so, why had they chosen her?
The town finally learns the truth. A truth that had been buried for nearly a century, hidden beneath whispers and shadows. Records and testimonies confirm what Officer Sarah and Dr. Rowland uncovered. The orphans who died tragically in the fire of 1923 were never given a proper burial. Their small bodies had been hastily placed beneath the old church basement, forgotten by time and neglected by those who should have remembered. The revelation shakes the townspeople to their core. Families who had heard stories of missing children now see their history brought painfully into the light. In response, the community comes together in an extraordinary act of unity. A memorial service is arranged, one not of spectacle, but of solemn remembrance. At the center of this moment stands Officer Sarah, who represents justice, Dr. Rowland, who represents reason, and Emily's family, who represents the innocence that had unknowingly carried the burden of these lost souls. The townspeople gather, holding candles as twilight settles, their faces reflecting grief, reverence, and a determination to finally make peace with the past. The air feels heavy but sacred as names of the lost children are read aloud, their existence finally acknowledged with dignity. For the first time in nearly 100 years, silence is broken not by cries of unrest, but by prayers of release.
The earth trembles softly as the small coffins, now properly prepared, are lowered into consecrated ground. People bow their heads, some in tears, others whispering apologies across generations. And in that moment, a quiet stillness washes over the crowd, as if unseen eyes are finally closing in rest. The spirits are laid to rest at last, no longer trapped, no longer forgotten. Emily, who had been the vessel of their sorrow, begins to recover in ways that surprise even the doctors. Her body heals fully, her color returns, and for the first time since the haunting began, she sleeps peacefully without a single nightmare. The dark circles beneath her eyes fade, her trembling ceases, and when she wakes, laughter escapes her lips like the return of spring after a long winter. Her family watches with joy and disbelief, holding her close as though they fear letting go would somehow bring the darkness back. Officer Sarah visits often, offering comfort, but also reflecting on how the line between the living and the lost is much thinner than most realize.
Dr. Rowland, a man once skeptical, now sits quietly at the edge of Emily's hospital bed, no longer able to dismiss what science cannot yet explain. He admits softly, almost to himself, that some answers do not belong in textbooks, but in the unspoken realm of memory and compassion. The town, too, is forever changed. Where once the church basement was a place of dread, it now becomes a site of remembrance, marked with a plaque bearing the names of the children whose cries once echoed in silence. People began visiting not out of fear, but out of respect, leaving flowers, toys, and prayers for those whose lives ended too soon. The haunting is over, but the lesson lingers. And as the story closes, the voiceover returns, gentle but firm, guiding the audience to reflection. Sometimes the past doesn't rest until we give it peace. Emily's story reminds us that the smallest act of remembrance can free even the heaviest of souls. The screen fades to black, leaving the viewer with a strange mix of emotions, chilled by the horror of what happened, but uplifted by the hope that even forgotten souls can find peace when the living choose compassion over neglect. It is a story not only of haunting, but of healing, a reminder to every listener that the way we treat history and the way we honor those who came before has power that reaches far beyond the grave. In Emily's laughter, in her restored light, there lies proof that remembrance matters, that dignity matters, and that no soul, no matter how lost, should ever remain forgotten.
I hope you enjoyed this video. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share and subscribe my channel, and also share this video with your family and friends. Let's see the view of weather looking so great. There are many clouds in the sky because today weather lives like enjoyable, and I make video for you. If this video give you a lesson, please like and share this video with your family and friend, because they give lesson from my video. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching.